Hey guys, this is Jeremy Jenks, Vice President of Sales with the Trembley Group. Thanks for tuning in. And I have got a special guest with me. This is Bryan Caskey of the law firm Caskey and Imgrund, who happens to be one of my favorite attorneys in the state of South Carolina. Bryan, you got us?
Hey, I got you, Jeremy. What's happening? Greetings from Columbia.
All right, awesome. I've asked Bryan to join us today and talk a little bit about the tax bills that just came out because I'm getting a lot of questions and I wanted to get some answers out to you guys, to our audience here, and make sure that everybody's comfortable with the tax bill that they just got in the mail because we're getting a lot of questions on the phone. So I wanted to reach out to an expert. So Bryan, why don't you start off, if you could, tell us a little bit about why the tax bills come out after the fact, and what does it mean that their taxes are paid in arrears?
Sure. Okay. Well, the nice thing about this time of year, it's Halloween, and you always get trick or treats. And the one of the tricks that you get is that your taxes are due in South Carolina for your property taxes. So they always come out about Halloween, give or take. Every county is a little different in when they do it. Bigger counties, smaller counties, but the counties all issue their tax bills roughly mid-October, end of October, for the calendar year in which they are assessed. So right now it is October 23rd. The tax bills just came out for most counties. They're not due until January. That's the deadline to pay them for January 2020, but that's for the 2019 calendar year. The taxes are assessed in arrears. You're paying the taxes for the year that you just had that property. So that's when they come out, and that's when they're due, and that's the time period that they're assessed for is the calendar year preceding the due date in January.
So if you pay when you pay in January of 2020, let's say, you're actually paying for the 2019 calendar year of taxes.
That's exactly right. They are assessed in arrears, and so you pay at the end of the term you use.
Okay, gotcha. I think that's the first important part for everybody to understand. And then let's also, and this is funny, it's a good lead in with the trick or treat. So if you got a trick tax bill in the mail and you're a little worried about why is this number look so big, why don't we talk a little bit about the 6% versus the 4% taxes, or in other words, the primary residence part?
Sure. Perfect lead in. So the fundamental thing to understand is in South Carolina, all property is taxed at 6%. That's the fundamental default rack rate. Now, there's, just like anything in the law, there's exceptions and there's exceptions to the exceptions. But a big fundamental exception to the 6% is if the property is your primary residence. If you live there and it's your principal residence, then it's taxed at 4%. In addition to it being taxed at 4%, it lowers the millage rate and some other various ways they calculate it, and it basically cuts your taxes in half. So if it's your primary residence, you're paying less of a percentage than if it was a commercial business or a house that's your second home. It's got to be your primary residence, or it's got to be somebody's primary residence.
Okay, interesting, awesome. So, and it is on your burden to go prove that. They're not just going to hand out the tax discount for primary residence, right?
No. The county's job is to try to collect as much money as they can so they can pay for roads and services and all the things that the county does. So if you want to make sure you have the primary residence, if it is your primary residence, you go down to the county, you go down to the administration building. Here in Richland County, here in Columbia, that's a 2020 Hampton Street. And there's a form that you fill out, and you got to show, all the various, bona fides that it is your primary residence, like your driver's license, your voting registration. You can show them a water bill. You can show them all the various things that proves to them that you do actually live there. Also here in Columbia, we've got Fort Jackson right here. We've got a lot of soldiers. You can even have the soldiers show like your orders that you live here. You got transferred, things like that. But fundamentally, you got to prove to the county it is your residence. They're not going to just assume it is, even if it was the last person's residence and it was their primary residence, and then they sell it to you. You don't get to carry over their exemption. The county's going to reset it and say, we assume nothing.
Now, the good news is I've heard is if you forget to do it, which I did with my new house, and our tax bill was, my wife about fell out of her chair, and I went, oh no, we got to go down to the auditor's office. Hey, I talk about this all day long, and I still forgot to do it with my own property. But they will reimburse you for a certain period of time, right?
That's correct. So let's say you bought a house in in June of a calendar year, and then you get everything, you do everything, but you forget to go down to the county's assessor's office and get that primary residence exemption. You certainly have until the end of the calendar year to do it. And that's an easy way to do it. Now, you can, even into the next year, you can still get it retroactively done. But at that point, in the next calendar year, you already should have paid that amount. But you can get it. It's still possible. But what I tell everybody is you have until the end of the calendar year to do it without jumping through a lot of hoops. But you can always go back and they'll reassess it. They're not going to try to to get money that they don't really lawfully, should tax you for. But we don't let people forget that when we do a closing. We send the deed to them. It's got a nice reminder a couple weeks later, make sure you go do this. We send them the form and we follow up, because I very much don't want to get a phone call from somebody that says, oh my gosh, I forgot to do this. I want to make sure that nobody's paying more taxes than they need to. And so our office is pretty diligent about reminding folks to do that.
That's fantastic. No, good for you guys. Not all attorneys are like that, because every once in a while I hear of a story. So that's awesome. So, all right. So let's talk about, so what happens is, in the questions I'm getting, got questions at church, got phone calls, got some emails over the weekend. Hey, I just got a tax bill. I sold this property already. I sold it back over the summer or whatever. Why did I just get the tax bill? So what's going on there? What's your advice?
Sure. So, when you do a real estate transaction, a deed's going to get recorded at the courthouse. And so the courthouse is going to get that. It's going to get indexed. But the courthouse isn't the taxing authority. That's the assessor and the auditor. And that's a completely different, part of the government. And sometimes the government, one department doesn't talk to the other department quite as quickly as you would hope. So it's entirely possible that a tax bill is going to be issued to somebody who doesn't own the property anymore. The closing happened months ago, maybe. So if you get a tax bill and you're like, hey, I sold my house 6 months ago, I don't know why they're sending it to me. At the closing, you would have already settled up one way or the other. So my advice to somebody who gets a tax bill that they don't own anymore would be to send that tax bill to the closing attorney, or if you have the person who bought your house, their information, send it to them. The good news is the county is not going to take the money twice. It's impossible to pay the county twice. If somebody pays it again, the county's going to send that money back and say, hey, we already got this money. Whoever sent it twice, here's your check back.
Got it. No, perfect. That's really good to know. And on the flip side, kind of the similar question, as I had somebody get a tax bill who asked me over the weekend and said, I just bought the place. I just bought it a couple of months ago. Why did I get a tax bill that I think was meant for the developer who built the townhomes? And what should I do with it?
Right. So if you've got townhomes, the tax bill may be for more than that part of the property. It may be for something different. But again, you should have settled up with your tax liability in one way or another at closing. I can get into the prorations if you want me to kind of talk about that, the difference between if a closing happens before the tax bills are out versus after the tax bills are out.
Yeah, let's touch on that real quick, but try and keep it simple for us laymen.
Okay. All right. I will try my best. And I promise not to use any Latin. So most of the year is before the tax bill comes out, because the tax bills don't come out until October. So most of the time you're doing a closing and the tax bill is not yet even available. It doesn't exist. It hasn't been issued. And so you prorate the taxes based on the last tax bill that came out the previous calendar year. And so at that point, you know that the taxes are going to come due in October and be due later, months after you close. So at that point, the buyer is going to own the property, because we're talking about months into the future. So what's going to happen is the buyer is going to get money from the seller. And let's just use a simple example. Let's say you close exactly at the midpoint of the year. Let's say you close exactly at the halfway point. So the seller will have owned the house for half of the year, and the buyer will own the house for the second half of the year. So you're going to prorate, and the seller's going to give half of the tax bill based on how you calculate it to the buyer. So the buyer will get that money at closing. And then later, when the tax bill comes out, the buyer will have already been made whole, and they will then pay the entirety of the tax bill, because the seller will have said, here's my money for the time of the year that I owned the house and lived in it. So that's typically how you prorate. The seller gives the prorated credit to the buyer. Now, there are a lot of times when you're buying a house at the end of the year. So this is now the opposite situation when the tax bill is already out. So let's
around
say
this time of the year.
This time of the year, right now. Let's say, you found a great house, but it's, October 23rd and you're doing a closing, tax bill is already out. Your lender, and most people are going to have a lender unless it's a cash deal, but let's say you got a loan and you've got a lender. Your lender is going to require that tax bill that is out has to be paid at closing because it can constitute an inchoate lien on property. So they're going to say that tax bill has to be paid, and they're going to make it a buyer's.
Is that Latin? Did you just use Latin?
No, I just used a big word.
Okay. Thought I caught you.
So the lender's going to require that be paid, and they're probably going to make the buyer pay that as kind of the buyer's closing costs. But the buyer's going to say, whoa, it's October 23rd. Why am I paying the entire tax bill when I haven't even lived in the house yet? Like, I'm moving in October 24th. And so what you're going to do is you're going to prorate again, and you're going to have the seller give the buyer the credit, and you're going to prorate from the time that the buyer lives in the house the other way. So you're going to prorate again, and just do it that way. So
the bottom line is the seller pays for their part of the year, the buyer pays for their part of the year, and it's just really the attorney is coordinating that exchange of funds at the closing table. And it's just a little bit tricky. So I can imagine the situation where the buyer gets the tax bill this time of year and they've already been given the funds at the closing table, but maybe they forgot. That's probably the trickier one.
That happens, especially if you close like in March and then you get all the way to the end of the year and you're like, hey, I didn't own the property. One tip that I always have for realtors, especially when you're representing somebody that may be getting the tax exemption and there was not a tax exemption on the property. Let's say the seller it's not their primary residence, but the buyer is going to be their primary residence. Mm-hmm. In the standard contract, that standard realtor's contract, which is great, wonderful, but it's going to say you're going to prorate based on the last year's tax bill, which is going to be the higher one, which is fine, but it's going to end up being a windfall to the buyer. So if you're representing the seller on that transaction, you may want to amend that contract and say, we'll prorate it based on it being the taxes at the buyer's primary residence exemption, because there's a couple $100, maybe a little bit more, depending on the value of the property, that the seller would otherwise give too much money to the buyer, because the buyer's not going to owe that much because they're going to go get the primary residence exemption for after closing. So that's a little tip for sellers if you're representing a seller and it's not their primary residence.
Very interesting. That's a great agent tip, and I think that's a good spot, for us to end, man. And I very, very much appreciate your time today. And as always, you are a wealth of knowledge. So,
all right. Well, always happy to give out free legal advice.
Perfect. All right. Thanks very much, Bryan.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.